how can we overcome, these sexual traumas or the ideas that were even dysfunction in itself? To your point, a lot of these studies only focus on the dysfunction and not to the pleasure point. Help me. How do I reclaim my pleasure?
So as a survivor of sexual trauma, I can speak to personal experience of how psychedelics accidentally healed my sexual dysfunction. So I was in my 20s and I never really had good sex because every time that I experienced sex, I didn't have a lot of arousal. There wasn't a lot of wetness. It was always painful. And I didn't orgasm with a man. And I could always orgasm on my own, but I really couldn't orgasm with a partner. And it wasn't until I had used MDMA in a sexual context with a partner around the time of Burning Man that I accidentally had a spontaneous sexual healing. And it was not, I mean, it wasn't planned, it wasn't expected, but I was able to overcome all of this dysfunction. And honestly, I started talking about it. This is my early 30s. And all my friends were like, what are you talking about? You took MDMA and you had sex, and that sounds crazy. And I was like, look, I know it was experimental, but something shifted in me, something changed. And I didn't know what happened. I didn't actually understand at the time because I was not in touch with my trauma. I had been dissociated for most of my 20s. Most of the time when I had sex, I dissociated out of my body. And it was a performative act. It was an act that I learned through watching porn. I was never really engaged with my own pleasure at all. I felt like sex was this thing that I was doing to make a man have a good experience so that I could prove how good in bed I was. And so the reason why I'm telling this personal story is because there are literally millions of women and men in the world like me that do not have good sex lives because they have trauma that they've not dealt with. And since starting my company, I've met so many women and quite a large number of men who have described their traumas to me. And it's so much bigger than the CDC says. So I just want to give that preface because sometimes, you have these experimental things that can happen. And then the real question is, what was the mechanism? What changed? So MAPS comes along and they start studying MDMA for trauma. And in fact, the number one cause of trauma, PTSD, in their studies is sexual trauma. Mm-hmm. So when you take a substance like MDMA and you are engaging in a context, which by the way, I am not recommending this, and this is not something I am like promoting, but I'm just explaining the mechanism, what I think happened for me. When you start to feel safe in a sexual context, when your nervous system's been programmed to feel unsafe, because your earliest sexual experience when I lost my virginity was a rape, when your nervous system's been programmed that sex is unsafe, and now you have a medicine that reprograms your nervous system to tell you that sex is in fact safe and that you can explore your pleasure without fear, that's pretty profound, right? So I personally started studying psychedelics for sexual enhancement because I thought to myself, okay, it's one thing to heal trauma. It's one thing to go through the MAPS protocol, for example. But what about the fact that the MAPS protocol doesn't address sexual dysfunction? It addresses the PTSD, but it's not addressing the actual issues that happen during sex. So when we were designing our protocol, we were really trying to understand, like, where do the problems occur for people and what is one of the main issues that people have? And for many, many women and men, sex is actually painful and it's very friction oriented, right? And so people go to their doctor and they say, hey, just use some extra lube. And honestly, there's research that suggests that lube is not as effective as people think it is for actually improving pleasure. So the reality is that sex is a very intimate experience. You're extremely vulnerable. You're extremely exposed. And when someone penetrates your body with their body, it can be extraordinarily powerful experience that if you haven't dealt with your traumas or you haven't dealt with your relationship to your body, your shame that maybe from religious upbringings, sex can be really frightening and your nervous system will not fully relax. So one of the things that we really teach in our protocol is this concept of embodied consent. And people talk about enthusiastic consent all the time, but they don't talk enough about the fact that consent can always be revoked and consent needs to be acknowledged physically as well as verbally. So people don't know how to read body language. And so a lot of trauma happens in that space between emotional intimacy and physical intimacy, where you're about to start having sex and maybe something's coming up for you and you just don't say anything, but your body's saying no and you're not saying anything. So fundamentally, great sex starts with safety. It starts with feeling very safe in your body with your partner. And I would highly recommend not experimenting with psychedelics in a sexual context unless you really know what you're doing, because frankly, it is extremely risky and for a variety of reasons. Number one, you can become prematurely attached to someone that you don't want to be in love with. MDMA is a profound love drug that is an oxytocin releasing agent that creates this profound medicine of love, which is oxytocin, but that can bond you to a person you don't want to be with. It can also make you trust someone that you may not want to trust. So I tell people, if you're going to experiment with even marijuana, like low dose, or any psychedelic in a sexual context, you really need to know the person that you're with. You really need to know what medicine you're taking, and you need to know that there are serious risks associated with engaging in this medicine in this context. That being said, there's a couple really interesting books. One's called The Encyclopedia of Aphrodisiacs, and one's called Transforming Orgasms. And it's basically presupposing that people have been using psychedelics for thousands of years, likely in a sexual context, and it may have actually enhanced our evolution. So we don't really know what happened thousands of years ago, but there are certainly lots of theories that psychedelics played a role in our evolution. I personally think that low doses of psychedelics in the next 10 to 20 years are going to be seen as medicine for healing sexual dysfunction. But right now, it is certainly risky, and it brings us back to memories from the 60s where people were having free love and lots of sex on lots of drugs, and it was dangerous. So I'm not trying to shepherd in a movement like that, but I do want people to know that part of the reason why people use psychedelics in a sexual context is because it enhances the sense of presence. It enhances emotional connection. It enhances the sense of merging with a person. So again, be careful who you merge with. It can enhance this concept of rhythmic entrainment, where you drop into your body and you start forgetting about your shame and you start experiencing bliss. It can also enhance ecstasy. And literally, there's a reason why MDMA is called ecstasy, right? Some people, there's lots of memes on the internet where people are using mushrooms in a sexual context. And there's lots of jokes around how mushrooms allow you to connect to the cosmic, source energy. But people are also using low dose ketamine for sexual contexts, right? But all of these things need research behind them before they're ready for prime time. All of this is risky if you engage in it right now, because frankly, if you don't know your dose, you don't know the context, if you have the wrong mindset, if you don't trust the person, you're setting yourself up for a lot of danger and also a high risk of trauma. Like, there's a lot of underground therapists that are not properly trained, that are promising sexual trauma healing, and they are engaging non-consensually with people where there wasn't a discussion about what was going to happen in that context. And they actually believe that by touching the person sexually, they are going to help heal them. I think the most fundamental conversation that we need to be having around all of this is that there is an above ground perspective on the psychedelic space and there's a below ground perspective. I think regardless of whether you think it's safe or not for people to use psychedelics in a sexual context, the most important thing that needs to be discussed is safety and consent. And so if that conversation is not being had prior to an experience, and you have an interaction with someone in a sexual context under the influence of psychedelics, you might reflect in retrospect that was a traumatizing experience. So I hope that was not too much of a diatribe. I just
No,
let
no.
people know that there's a lot of pleasure to be had in a sexual context, but again, it has to be done with safety. And Anne Shulgin and Sasha Shulgin, there's a video on their Instagram, the Shulgin Foundation, and these couple were pioneers in the use of psychedelics for couples and in sexuality. They use psychedelics sexually consistently for their relationship. So I think we need to respect the past. We need to honor our history as humans, and we need to move into the future with new knowledge that we might be able to create safer sexual experiences for everyone that are more pleasurable.